It would take 34 years, a technological leap forward, and a killer's own careless words spoken from the witness stand to finally close a door that Christmas 1987 had slammed open in a small Maine city. The Northeast had already begun its descent into winter in the weeks before the holiday season of 1987. Waterville, Maine, sitting along the Kennebec River's quiet banks, was one of those towns that transforms when December arrives. Decorative lights strung across residential streets competed with the crystalline brightness of frost-covered lawns. The downtown concourse, that cluster of bars and lounges where the young and restless gathered on weekend nights, was already filling with the anticipatory energy of people preparing to celebrate. Snow would come, the kind of deep, serious snow that defines life in central Maine. And when it did, it would cover the region in a blanket so thick that a person could disappear into it, and the world would simply accept it as winter doing what winter does. Janet Brochu existed at the intersection of youth and medical fragility. At 20 years old, she embodied the independence of young adulthood while simultaneously managing the daily discipline required by insulin-dependent diabetes. Every morning and evening brought the needle, the measured dose, the constant negotiation with a body that demanded attention and compliance. She had been employed for 18 months at a medical facility in the area, working in nutritional services, which meant her job was tangentially connected to the very illness she battled in her personal life, a strange kind of symmetry. Janet lived with her adoptive parents, Geraldine and Albert, in their home on Cushman Road in Winslow, a neighboring community close enough to Waterville that the two towns blended together in the minds of local residents. On the evening of December 23rd, her intentions that night were unremarkable. She dressed and told her mother she was heading out to accomplish a couple of practical errands. There was a check to cash at some point, and she planned to grab food at McDonald's, nothing that suggested late-night adventures or concerning decisions. Her departure was the kind that didn't trigger parental instinct to worry. She was a young woman going out before dark, engaged in ordinary activities. Her mother watched her leave without the kind of dread that sometimes precedes tragedy, because there was nothing in that moment to trigger it. Waterville's downtown core was where young adults congregated in those pre-internet years when physical gathering spaces defined a generation's social life. The bars had names that locals knew like they knew the names of their own streets. P. Woody's was one of those places, and it was there that Janet encountered two men sometime in the evening. The interaction was casual, people talking to people, strangers becoming acquaintances through the simple mechanism of proximity and conversation. The men suggested they move to a different venue, a different bar, and Janet accepted. There was no red flag waving, no moment where she should have recognized danger. It was the night before Christmas in a small Maine city, and people were doing what people do, venturing out, meeting new faces, attempting to create memories. At the next location, the ID check revealed an immediate obstacle. Janet was 20, and Maine law was unforgiving on the question of age restrictions for alcohol service. The staff didn't deliberate, they directed her to leave. She found herself thrust into the parking lot, the temperature already dropping as evening transformed into night, and she wasn't well. Nausea was churning in her stomach, her body protesting against something, and she was in no condition to navigate her way home on foot through a Maine winter night. Here's where the narrative branches into a moment that would reverberate through decades. One of the two men, the one she'd been talking to, more directly, went back inside the bar. Her purse was still there, still on the table or bar where she'd left it, and he retrieved it. He carried it back out into the parking lot and made a pronouncement to the other patrons who'd noticed the interaction. He was going to take care of her. That was the claim. That was the commitment he verbalized to witnesses. A woman who was sick, who was alone, who needed help, and he was the one who would provide it, except he didn't. When she asked him to take her home, he refused. His stated reasoning was that she didn't feel well, which was paradoxically the exact reason she needed assistance. He abandoned her in that parking lot at midnight on December 23, 1987, without the purse he'd promised to protect, without money, without any mechanism to secure transportation in the darkness. She was left standing there while he went back inside. That image, a young woman alone in a parking lot without her possessions on the night before Christmas, would become the last confirmed sighting anyone made of Janet Brochu while she was alive. The man in question, initially referenced by the name Jerry in witness statements, would later be identified by his actual identity, Gerald Goodale. When Janet didn't arrive home that night, her parents entered a different dimension of existence. Christmas morning arrived without her. The day continued without her. The parents contacted authorities, and what began as a missing person report evolved into something larger. By January, state police had become involved. The Attorney General's office had engaged, alerts circulated across the country. Divers descended into the Sebastukuk River searching for any trace of her. Weeks passed. Months accumulated. The family existed in a space between hope and despair, between the possibility that she might still be found alive and the creeping certainty that something irreversible had occurred. On March 19, 1988, nearly 3 months after she'd walked out of her parents' home, a property owner named Christopher Anthony discovered a nude body in the river near Pittsfield. The remains were pulled from the water. Dental records and jewelry confirmed the identity. Janet Brochu was finally found, though not in any of the ways her family had hoped. The distance between Waterville and Pittsfield, approximately 20 miles, told investigators something significant. This was not the location of someone's desperate drowning accident. This was where someone had transported a body and disposed of it, leaving her in the freezing current to become whatever the river wanted to make of her. Gerald Goodale's name, already present in police records from the earliest days of the investigation, now became the focal point. He lived with his parents on Water Street in Waterville's South End. Neighbors described a man without stable employment, someone who seemed to exist on the margins, fixing cars, doing odd jobs, contributing little to nothing to mainstream society. He was also described as quarrelsome, the kind of person who created friction wherever he went. Investigators questioned him shortly after Janet's disappearance. His story was simple and conclusive from his perspective. He left her standing in the parking lot, unharmed and conscious, and that was the end of his involvement. Investigators didn't believe him, but belief and proof occupied different universes. When her body was discovered and Goodale was questioned again, the pressure intensified. They had questions now, more sophisticated questions, more aggressive questioning, more details they could throw at him to test his consistency, but they still didn't have what mattered. There was no DNA technology available in 1988 to bridge the gap between suspicion and certainty. There was no eyewitness who'd seen them leave together. There was no physical evidence placing him in Pittsfield with her body. He was the obvious suspect, the man who'd claimed he'd take care of her before abandoning her sick and alone. But the legal system in 1988 couldn't convert suspicion into conviction. The investigation stalled. It didn't close, it simply stopped moving, like a mechanism that runs out of fuel. Goodale's name remained in the file. Everyone involved in the case knew it. The investigators knew. The family knew. But knowing the right answer isn't the same as proving it, and without proof, the justice system remains inert. 5 months after Janet's body was recovered from the river, Goodale made an error. He didn't repeat his previous mistake with a different victim, he repeated his entire methodology. On August 9, 1988, a 23-year-old woman named Geraldine Finn left Pete and Larry's lounge at the Holiday Inn on Main Street in Waterville. She left with Gerald Goodale in his blue Chevrolet Blazer. The crucial difference between this departure and Janet's was that Geraldine's friends saw her get in. They remembered the truck, they remembered Goodale. They would later testify to these observations in court. 5 days passed. Geraldine's body was discovered in a shallow grave in the woods off Route 201 in Skowhegan. She had been strangled. Her killer had attempted to hide her remains beneath layers of earth and vegetation, believing the distance from Waterville and the forest's concealment would prevent discovery. He was wrong. The investigation room filled with a detail that nobody missed or minimized: Geraldine Finn. Geraldine Brochu, the victim in the new case, shared her first name with Janet's adoptive mother, and Geraldine was the longer version of Gerald, the killer's own given name. Whether this was coincidence or whether it revealed something about Goodale's psychology remained an open question, but nobody in that room treated it as random. This time there were witnesses. This time there was the direct evidence that Janet's case had desperately needed. Goodale was arrested and charged. In June 1989, a jury convicted him of Geraldine Finn's murder. He received a 75-year sentence, delivered in a Maine courtroom where the Deputy Attorney General made a statement for the record. The prosecution argued he'd killed Janet too, that he was a repeat murderer who'd learned nothing and forgotten nothing except how to be caught. During the pre-sentencing investigation, Goodale was questioned specifically about Janet Brochu's death. His response, delivered in his own words and documented by investigators, would become the bombshell that echoed through 3 decades. He didn't kill Janet, he claimed, but he knew who did, and he wouldn't tell anyone. The courtroom heard this, the judge heard this, the prosecution heard this. A man receiving a 75-year sentence for one murder casually announced that he possessed knowledge of another, and that he had no intention of sharing it. The logic was perverse and bulletproof. What could a court do to a person already facing 3/4 of a century behind bars? Threaten him with more time? He was already gone. Offer him a deal? He'd already refused one implicitly by maintaining his silence. Gerald Goodale entered Maine State Prison in Warren carrying that secret alongside his conviction. For 34 years, from 1989 until his guilty plea in 2023, he held onto it. He never spoke. He never elaborated. He never provided the answer to the question his own words had raised. The Brochu family's experience during those decades occupied a unique space in the landscape of grief. They weren't dealing with complete mystery that can be its own kind of pain, but it has a different texture. Instead, they lived with partial knowledge, which psychiatrists and grief counselors recognize as potentially more torturous than total ignorance. They knew the suspect's name. They knew he was imprisoned for another murder. They knew he'd made an admission. But they didn't know the complete story of what happened to their daughter in those final hours. They knew the beginning and the ending, but the middle remained a locked box. Every December, the season's festivities became a minefield. Christmas lights on Winslow's streets, families preparing celebrations, and the Brochus in their home on Cushman Road, waiting for an answer that the man in Warren knew and refused to give. Both Geraldine and Albert passed away before the resolution came. They lived their entire remaining lives with this unfinished business, never receiving the closure of understanding exactly how their daughter's final moments unfolded. During those same decades, something remarkable happened that wasn't mandated by any official protocol. One investigator, year after year, made the drive to the Brochu home. This wasn't a standard part of the job description. There was no memo requiring annual visits to the families of cold case victims. There was no checkbox on any evaluation form. But this investigator understood something crucial. The Brochus didn't need case updates. They needed to know that their daughter hadn't been filed away and forgotten. They needed confirmation that somewhere, someone was still thinking about Janet, still holding her memory, still refusing to accept that the case was truly closed just because nothing was happening. This act of simple persistence, repeated year after year, became its own kind of justice. Not the kind that satisfies the law, but the kind that honors the dead and reminds the grieving that they haven't been abandoned by the system. In 2015, the Maine State Police made a structural decision that would eventually matter tremendously. They established an unsolved homicide unit, not just a couple of detectives juggling cold cases alongside their current caseloads, but an entire department dedicated exclusively to cases that had gone cold. These detectives didn't split their time between yesterday's murders and today's crimes. They focused entirely on the past. They had access to modern forensic technology. They had scientists and lab support. They had a budget. New Hampshire had created a similar unit in 2009, but Maine was playing catch-up. And when they launched their operation, they inherited 69 unsolved cases to work through. The Janet Brochu file was exactly what this unit had been created to solve. A known suspect already serving time for a related murder. Evidence from 1988 that had never been tested with modern DNA technology. A cryptic admission sitting in the file like an unfinished puzzle. The Unsolved Homicide Unit picked up that file and began applying 21st century science to 33-year-old evidence. The results arrived in 2021. The specific methodology wasn't disclosed to the public, but the conclusion was absolute. The DNA evidence was strong enough, stronger indeed, than anything 1988 had been able to produce. The case could now go before a grand jury. The pieces that hadn't fit in 1988 suddenly aligned in 2021. There were delays, certainly. The COVID-19 pandemic had created a backlog in the justice system. Judges were scarce. Cases sat idle waiting for grand jury convocation. But on May 13, 2021, the Somerset County grand jury indicted Gerald Goodale for Janet Brochu's murder. He was 61 years old, already imprisoned for the better part of 3 decades, and now facing charges for the crime he'd always been suspected of committing. Investigators went to the prison to notify him. It wasn't an arrest in the traditional sense, he was already behind bars, but it was notification that the secret he'd protected, the knowledge he'd claimed to possess, the non-answer he'd given in court 32 years earlier, no longer protected him. The grand jury indictment spelled out his culpability in legal language. He had intentionally or knowingly caused Janet's death, or at minimum, he'd engaged in conduct displaying such profound indifference to human life that he'd caused her death as a consequence. 2 years of legal proceedings followed. Goodale initially maintained his not guilty plea. Lawyers became involved. Motions were filed. The machinery of the justice system ground forward. But eventually, Goodale chose a different path. On March 2, 2023, 35 years and several months after the Christmas Eve night when Janet left her home, Gerald Goodale stood in Somerset County District Court and entered a guilty plea. The judge sentenced him to 32.5 years for Janet's murder, with the sentence running concurrently with his existing 75-year sentence for Geraldine's. Concurrent means the sentences operate in parallel rather than sequentially. Practically speaking, it altered his earliest possible release date to February 2034, at which point he would be in his late 70s. Whether he would actually be released then, whether he would survive his imprisonment, remained questions without answers. But the legal record was now clear. He was guilty of both murders, not just one. Family members who finally received what they'd been waiting for spoke about the resolution with a complicated mix of relief and frustration. A relative named Kathy Welsh acknowledged that murdering someone on Christmas Eve occupied a particular circle of monstrosity. The parents of a victim would experience ordinary grief. The parents forced to experience it during a season dedicated to family and celebration entered something deeper. She expressed gratitude that there was finally a conviction, a legal closing of a case that the courts had been unable to seal for decades. But the gratitude existed alongside anger at the time that had been required, at the decades of uncertainty, at a system that needed technological advancement to accomplish what should have been straightforward. Geraldine and Albert Brochu never heard the guilty plea. They never received the confirmation they'd sought their entire lives. They passed away before the DNA results came back, before their daughter's killer offered anything resembling acknowledgement of her death, but their family, the relatives who inherited their grief, finally had something tangible. The Janet Brochu case, running from 1987 through 2023, offers 3 distinct lessons applicable to anyone in America whose loved one remains a victim of an unsolved crime. The first lesson concerns institutional structure. Maine State Police made a decision in 2015 to create a specialized unit dedicated exclusively to cold cases. This wasn't inevitable. It wasn't mandated by federal law. It was a choice to allocate resources differently, to say that some percentage of our investigative capacity will focus on yesterday's crimes rather than today's crimes. In its first decade of operation, this unsolved homicide unit solved 8 cases out of 69, with Janet Brochu's murder being among them. If you have a loved one whose case remains open, identify whether your state has a comparable specialized unit. If it doesn't, consider contacting your elected representatives. The difference between detectives splitting time between old and new cases versus detectives working exclusively on old cases is the difference between files that remain dormant and files that receive genuine investigative momentum. The second lesson is astonishingly simple and direct. If your loved one's case remains unsolved, call the investigating agency and ask a single, specific question. Has the physical evidence been retested using modern DNA technology? Goodale was a suspect from day one in Janet's case. Investigators knew. The family knew, but nothing could be done until the forensic technology caught up to the criminology of the case. When the Unsolved Homicide Unit asked that exact question, have we tested the old evidence with new tools? It led directly to the 2021 charges. There's no complexity required to pose this question. There's no need for legal representation or specialized knowledge. It's a straightforward inquiry. Is there evidence? Has it been tested? And if not, why not? The third lesson transcends institutional frameworks and procedures. There's no manual that requires investigators to visit grieving families every year. There's no law demanding that cold case detectives maintain contact with people whose loved ones remain murdered. It's not part of the official job. But one investigator understood something profound about the human need to know that you haven't been forgotten, that your tragedy hasn't been filed away in a storage room and abandoned. Year after year, this person drove to the Brochu home and sat with them and communicated through presence what couldn't always be communicated through information. If you work in law enforcement or the justice system, understand that this act of simple, persistent remembrance costs nothing but means everything. The family doesn't need case updates. They need to know that someone hasn't stopped thinking about the person they lost. Subscribe to make sure you don't miss our next video. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Thank you for taking the time to learn about Janet Brochu and the decades of waiting her family endured.